So welcome everyone. I know this is the last session of the afternoon, but Salim and I just made a pact to make it the most interesting session of the day by a 10x factor. So we're going to give it our best. It's a big bar. It was a really amazing day. My name is Sylvia Solit. I am a senior client advisor with Prime Quadrant, and this was my first day at work. I was just hired. So imagine stepping into this as your first day. What an incredible day, right? Really unbelievable. So they gave me a very difficult task on my first day, which is to interview Salim Ismail.
Why is that hard?
It's actually not hard at all because Salim and I have been friends for years. So it is really kind of beautiful kismet that we find each other on the stage together today. In fact, Salim is the reason why I came to Prime Quadrant. So it is my honor to interview you today. And as way of introduction, Salim Ismail is the best-selling author of Exponential Organizations. He's the founder of EXOWorks and OpenEXO, and he is also the founder and president of Singularity University, and he's on the board of the X Prize. Those are all very impressive accomplishments, but my way of knowing Salim is he is an exponential human, and his impact on a lot of people's lives, including my own, is an exponential impact. Many of the most profound transformations personally and professionally that I've experienced in the years that we've known each other are really from Salim. It's kind of the Salim X factor. So Salim, why don't you start by telling us what is the Salim X factor and what have you been up to the past 10 years?
Okay, just how many of you have heard me speak before? And how many of you have read the book already? Okay, a couple of you. And how many of you are familiar with Singularity University? Okay, got it. All right, all the people in the front here, clearly. Okay, so I'm from Toronto. I went to Waterloo. I went to Europe for 10 years. I've been in the US for 20 years. About 15 years ago, I was the head of innovation at Yahoo, running their incubator. And I came across a fundamental problem that's drove me crazy then and is still bugging me now, which is when you try anything disruptive in a legacy environment, the immune system attacks you. Because all our organizations are built to resist change and withstand risk. And I went from Yahoo to helping build out Singularity University, where my secret superpower is that I led all the programs for about 7 years. So if there's a lecture, lab, workshop on blockchain, I've heard it 60 times, autonomous cars 60 times, biotech 60 times. As my wife says, I can pretend to speak about anything now. And I wrote this book on the back of that, basically saying the way the world is changing pretty fundamentally. We have 20 Gutenberg moments hitting us at the same time today. You know, in the 15th century, the printing press completely changed the world. And we call that a Gutenberg moment because it completely transformed society. Well, AI completely transformed society. Blockchain completely, solar energy, biotech breakthroughs, autonomous cars. And we are not able to absorb all of this. And one of the comments I make is that this is breaking every institution by which we run the world. All of our legal systems, healthcare systems, intellectual property systems are all education. All our education systems are designed to take a young child, train them through their early 20s to be ready for the job market, except we have no idea what a job looks like in 5 years. Right? So this is some very structural problems that we're seeing. There are two things that are very unique about technology I just wanted to touch on. I missed this morning's session, so hence I'm just giving you a quick summary of what I would have said had I been there. So the first is that we've been following Moore's Law and exponential technology for 15 years now. And for the first time in human history, we have a dozen technologies all moving on this exponential doubling pattern. Drones are doubling every 9 months in their price performance. Biotech every 6 months. AI systems are doubling every 3 months. And we've just never seen any time in human history this many technologies move at the same time. And the downstream effects of that are the second piece of what's unique about technology is that throughout human history, it's always been true that advanced technologies cost a lot. And only a government or a big corporate lab could do R&D, launch new products and services. Today, for the first time in human history, advanced technologies are cheap. Solar energy is cheap, sensors are cheap, blockchains are open source and free. And this allows now disruptive innovation by anybody, totally permissionless, And we're going to see an explosion of innovation come unlike anything we've ever seen throughout human history as we intersect all these technologies. Take Vitalik Buterin from here in Toronto, middle-class kid, ignores his professors, gets together with a few friends, and boom, you have Ethereum. $400 billion ecosystem that no banker understands. Nobody understands, honestly. And there's some bylaw that you have to be under 25 to program a blockchain that's written somewhere, right? And so there's some really fascinating things happening with technology. The book has taken me on kind of a wild ride over the years. It turns out a consulting firm out of Europe is using it to advise 36 heads of state. So I've had some rather interesting conversations. I got a phone call from the Vatican saying the Pope is trying to change the church and his immune system is 2,000 years old. Can we have you come in? So I did a workshop with the 80 senior leaders at the Vatican, which was interesting. And so some really fascinating things happening around the world. So that's a very quick summary of what we're seeing. I joined a few years ago the board of the XPRIZE Foundation, where we give large public prizes wherever there are market failures. And can I see a show of hands? How many of you are familiar with XPRIZE? Okay, a few of you. I'm just going to take a second. This is really powerful. The founder, Peter Diamandis, was trying to get into NASA and get into be an astronaut when he was a kid. And he applied to astronaut school, and NASA said, there's no way you're going to make it. You're not diligent enough or disciplined enough to be an astronaut. And so then the Cold War ended, and space investment by governments stopped. And he really wanted to get into space. He happened to read the biography of Charles Lindbergh, who crossed the Atlantic for the first time 100 years ago. And it turns out Lindbergh did it to win a prize, which was about $3 million in today's money. What Peter noticed when he read about this was that 15 teams spent $50 million in R&D trying to win the $3 million. And the resulting innovation collectively created the commercial aviation industry. And so he said, this guy put up a $3 million prize, got a 15x R&D spend, created a whole industry. The space industry stuck. And so he got the FAA, the Lindbergh family, the NASA astronauts lined up behind him on a stage and said, I'm announcing a $10 million prize for anybody that can create a private plane that will go twice into orbit within 2 weeks. 7 years later, 30 teams had spent $150 million in R&D trying to win that prize. The winning design is now Virgin Galactic. And the alumni from all of those teams have gone on to build SpaceX, Blue Origin, and now we have $1 trillion space industry that didn't exist before. So what we do at XPRIZE is we put down honeypots wherever there are market failures and governments aren't doing enough, et cetera. 2 prizes we have right now is a $100 million prize for anybody that can figure out how to extract carbon at scale out of the atmosphere. Because we're not going to see a political solution to climate change. Nation states as a construct can't solve climate change, right? And so we need a technological approach to this. And we have 2,000 teams that registered for that prize, which is unbelievable. And the other prize we have that's really ridiculous is an age reversal X prize. Somebody wins $101 million if you can reverse musculature, neural retention, and immune system by 20 years each. And there are 1,500 teams that have entered for that prize. And so we're going to break through the aging barrier in the next 5 to 6 years. So don't get hit by a bus, is what I would say there. So.
No, that's amazing, super inspirational. One of my favorite quotes of yours is, you're either disrupting or being disrupted. And so when I first read this book, you described what the mothership is and what the immune system is of the mothership and why that is so prohibitive to innovation. That concept really stuck with me. It's probably the concept that stuck with me the most in reading this book, because I could never look at a company the same way. I'd always think, where's the immune system of this company before making any kind of investment decision? So taking that concept and then applying it to the world of the family office. In the family office world, we often say from shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations, right? So there's this idea that families create wealth and then the wealth dissipates in 3 generations. So what can families learn about embracing disruption?
So what happens in family offices, and certainly intergenerational investing, and certainly if you've been in it over time, is over time you become more and more cautious. Right? And you try and conserve and protect, et cetera. And it turns out in today's world, the disruption means you can't be conservative. So for example, from a corporate perspective, any corporation that tries to be in the steady state and protect their market share is doomed. In fact, the structure of existing operating companies won't survive the next 10 or 15 years if nothing with what's coming with AI. Because today, any entrepreneur can enter a legacy industry, leverage new technologies, and totally disrupt it, right? And so Elon is probably the best example of that. No experience in the space, energy, or car sector, and he's created market leaders in all of them. And by the way, his methodology for doing things, building companies, is absurdly simple. He looks at a technology that's growing exponentially, whether it's solar energy or lithium-ion battery costs or neural interfaces, and he looks out 10 years. Where will that technology be on a 10-year doubling pattern? And what will the price performance be? And let's build a company to intercept that curve, because then you hit it on the vertical, right? And so he just does that over and over again. Non-trivial to last the 10 years, granted, but that's the methodology, and I think we're going to see more and more of that. So the secret here is if you're a legacy car company and you're not innovating at that pace, you're going to get left behind. So the only opportunity left is to be a disruptor, not be the disrupted. Because if you're not the disruptor, you will be disrupted in a world that's increasingly disruptive, right? There's a really good piece of news, though, which is that today, because the cost of innovation is so low, you can do a portfolio of innovations and experiments at the edge. In the past, if you wanted to do disruptive innovation in a legacy company, you had to do what was called make a big bet and put a lot of resources behind it. The CFO hated you and would defund it as fast as they could, et cetera. Now you can do a portfolio approach, not even tell the CFO, and then only double down when you see success. And what we found over the years, because the book is now about a decade old, is this model is proving to be more and more accurate in terms of predicting where things will go, because inherent in the design of what we call an exponential organization is extreme flexibility, adaptability, agility, and speed.
So does that mean that the older generation needs to be more flexible, adaptable, and what does it look like from one generation to the next?
So second generation needs to just adopt these new principles. For older generation needs to just get out of the way. Which is true for all of our government officials also, by the way, because if you look at most of our heads of state, they have no idea what is going on, right? And so this is a really huge structural challenge that we have, which also applies to the legacy medical industry and every major industry that is run by legacy thinking. Can I tell a funny anecdote here?
Yeah, please.
So the book has sold now close to 1 million copies. There's hundreds of thousands of these organizations adopting it. I've been in the boardroom of probably 200 of the Fortune 500, Procter & Gamble, Black & Decker, HP, Visa. Mostly I yell at the boards and then allow the innovators to do what they're able to do in their organizations. The thing that we've seen is that the more you let the internal agility take place, then you unleash a wave of innovation. And so that's what we were going to expect to see, especially from an investing perspective, because traditional investing was looking very much at, say, real estate or treasuries, or you do treasury, and we have a nice balanced approach across portfolios. Now you need to be increasingly driven. My favorite example of a future portfolio, if you're a family office, I was talking to a family office that has gone through our programs and gone through Singularity, et cetera, but they're about $100 million. And he has 70% of his net worth in high-yielding public equities, high dividend-yielding public equities that keeps the cash flow stable, and 30% in high-risk startup venture capital, and now 15% in Bitcoin, right? Buy Bitcoin, by the way. Okay. So that is not something you will ever hear from a traditional investment advisor. That's structure, right? And so there's a very big structural change coming, because you can actually invest in disruptive technologies at a very low cost today with a very high outcome, and that de-risks your overall portfolio.
I would also think culturally, from having worked with many families myself, it's important to create a culture where you embrace failure, because if you're going to have this kind of investment strategy, even if it's at the fringes, you're going to see a lot of failure. There's one family that I worked with briefly who, when something failed, especially if it was the next gen that had led that investment, they would have a failure party. They would actually have a failure party where they would all get together and they would celebrate that they had failed because that meant that they were taking enough risk.
In the more successful startup ecosystems, when a company fails, they'll do an Irish wake. And everybody gets together, gets drunk, and then helps the founders find their next gig.
Oh, beautiful. Well, continuing on that, you also speak in the book about an MTP, a massive transformative purpose. And you speak about that in the context of companies, but I also think it applies to families. So can you explain to us what is an MTP and how would a family create one?
Yeah, so in 2012, we scanned the 200 fastest growing unicorns in the world and kind of teased out what they were doing. We labeled Uber it's scaling by not hiring its own staff. TED is leveraging its community. Airbnb is tapping into other people's assets. And that aggregate set of characteristics led to what we now call the EXO model. And one of the things we noticed that all these organizations were deeply purpose-driven. It was very obvious what problem they were trying to solve. Uber, everybody should have a private driver. Google, let's organize the world's information. And we coined the term your massive transformative purpose. And if you want to be a successful startup today, you have to state upfront and clear as to what problem you're fundamentally trying to solve. And then all the other characteristics come into support of that, and then allows you to build the organization. Later on, we found that this purpose-driven kind of thinking was becoming more and more predominant. Probably the most notable example was Paul Pullman was the CEO of Unilever a few years ago. Calls me up and says, hey, can I have you come and talk to my top 200 executives? And after that session, he ordered every brand in Unilever to take on an MTP. And 4 years later, the 5 most profitable brands were the ones that had adopted it the most. So you can start to see the model bite. When you bring it to a family office, it really brings to, one of the things you work on that I think is really powerful and very, very important is when you have that fundamental problem statement as to what aspect of the world your family office wants to address and try and fix or change, you're making the capital more and more conscious. You're lifting the vibration of the energy of that money, which is incredibly important and deeply necessary in today's world. And I think that will yield many, many downstream effects as we go along.
Yeah, so what is your MTP?
Mine is to transform civilization. It's a niche project. By the way, for anybody that's interested, I'm doing a session later tonight, like a French salon on metaphysics, philosophy, and the meaning of life. Alcohol mandatory. Because we never get to have a structured conversation about why does life exist and is there a God, et cetera, et cetera. So we'll be running that session. My 90-year-old dad came to one of these. And I'd done a TEDx talk here in Toronto a few years ago titled, How Do You Fix Civilization? Mostly talking about this immune system problem, saying if we can't solve that problem, it doesn't matter what the technologies breakthroughs are. So I'm running this little workshop, and somebody said, hey, I really loved your TEDx talk. My dad's hand goes up, and he goes, can I heckle? And I said, yeah, of course you can. He said, totally disagree with your talk. And I said, okay, do you not think we need to fix civilization? And he says, no, of course we do. Of course we need to fix it, but the problem is not the fixing part, it's the civilization part. He said, we've materialized the world, we've not civilized the world. Right? And it was this wisdom bomb from the elders that just came down, boom. We now have to do the work to civilize it. Because we're apes with tools operating in tribal patterns, scaling damage everywhere.
Yeah, apes with really powerful tools.
Powerful tools.
Because
we have 2 futures as a humanity, as a species. One is a Star Trek future, and the other is a Mad Max future. Right? And I used to think that we're going to go down one path or the other, but we're seeing both today. You look at Gaza or Ukraine, that's full-on Mad Max, right? Whereas we have the opportunity to tilt to a really magnificent, abundant future. And maybe I'll touch on this one theme just for a second. One of the things we've seen over the last decade and a half or so of studying this deeply is that technology delivers abundance. And as we move to that new model, we have an unbelievable opportunity to deliver abundance to the world in terms of healthcare, education, clean water, energy. And this becomes very, very profound in terms of what that makes available to human beings, lifting us up Maslow's hierarchy in a very rapid way. And people don't see this because we always get stuck in the news cycles, but the world is in an infinitely better place than we've ever had it in the history of the world. If you went back 200 years ago, 94% of the human population globally lived in extreme poverty. $2 a day equivalent to $11, I think is the number. Today, we're down to 9%. Right? You don't see that in the news anywhere. And so this is the incredibly amazing world that we live in. And we're living unbelievable health spans because we just have so much more data to navigate the world. And this is just before we even bring AI online. By the way, I don't believe AI achieves consciousness. And I can talk about why if you're interested.
Yeah, please do. I think everyone would like to hear that.
Oh, okay. I have a huge beef when people say AIs are going to become smarter than human beings. Okay, I get really angry at the conversation. Not because it's not possible, et cetera, but what the hell do you mean by intelligence when you say that we'll have machines becoming more intelligent than human beings? So the IQ test as we know it measures 2 out of the dozen facets of intelligence that we have. It measures the speed of thought processing and the ability to match concepts across frameworks. But it doesn't measure emotional intelligence. It doesn't measure spiritual intelligence or the Eastern concept of presence or awareness. It doesn't measure linguistic intelligence or spatial intelligence. We bring a lot of that to bear. If you're a leader, your emotional intelligence becomes very important in when you're making choices, right? And AI doesn't deal with any of this. So if anybody says to you an AI will become smarter than a human being, beat them with a stick. Because and challenge them and say, what do you mean by intelligence, right? Now, the other end of the spectrum is, okay, will AIs become conscious? And now we have a harder problem even because we don't have a definition for consciousness and we don't have a test for consciousness. So what are we talking about? If you talk to philosophers, they will say that a subset of consciousness is self-awareness, right? You look like you're self-aware, so I attribute self-awareness to you. I feel like I'm self-aware. My wife disagrees. So it's hard to even have the conversation. Right? You'll see people getting themselves wrapped up in a rabbit hole, and you always end up triggering the amygdala. And you end up looking at it from the Hollywood lens, where the Terminator happens, or Skynet, or the Matrix, and the robot overlords take over the world. If human beings are lucky, we're pets, and if we're unlucky, we're food. Kind of like, it goes that way. But if you look at how we're actually applying AI to the world today, it's profoundly constructive and additive to human experience, not detractive. And so I really get annoyed when people say that, because there's no proof points for the other case of it. And there's all sorts of other kind of framings to this. We are evolved for 4 billion years to do 2 things, to survive and procreate. And AI doesn't suffer from those limitations. So the idea that it would worry about that stuff is really ridiculous.
Yeah, absolutely.
End of rant.
That was a good one. Another key principle in the book is autonomy.
Yeah.
Autonomy. And so in a family, I think of this as intrapreneurship. So entrepreneurship is the entrepreneurship inside of the family. So have you seen a family who has fostered this well, and how did they do it?
One of the most advanced family offices I've seen is a company out of Brazil called Votorantim, which is a $23 billion conglomerate. And it's a family business that's been built over 100 years or so. And they've evolved an incredibly sophisticated model because they've got hundreds of cousins and second cousins and uncles and aunts, et cetera, growing up. Do you bring people into the family business or not? Do they stay on the investing side? Do they go to the foundation? And they've worked out a very sophisticated mechanism and filtering system to see if somebody wants to work in the business, are they better set up outside it? They put them through an education process. They test them as if they were a normal employee. And if they can rise to leadership levels, they're able to do that. And what they found over time is the whole system becomes incredibly powerful for maintaining family cohesion. And it's incredibly healthy to watch that happen. And I've completely forgotten your question.
Just how do they encourage entrepreneurship, which you kind of answered.
Yeah, so they actually allow every single person to choose what their MTP is, and then find a place in the family, the constellation of all of the efforts that they make to say where might they fit the best, what fundamental aspect of their expression do they want to show up with.
Do you know at what age a family member finds their MTP? Is this...
Like literally, well, I mean, look, I was about 45 before I figured out what I wanted to do with my life, right? If you're lucky, you're like 10 or 11 and you go, yeah, I want to do X. The younger you are, the luckier you are in one sense because you know what you want to do. although it's highly interesting to cast around for a long time before figuring it out, being lost is also a wonderful thing to experience.
How does a family office leverage an EXO model?
I think two ways. I think what I would do is, so we've, over the years, we've created a global community and ecosystem that's now about 40,000 people around the world in 150 countries. And what we've been trying to do, my secret plan is to create like a Peace Corps of people that can transform their governments, cities, countries, et cetera. We've been creating tools for transformation. So I mentioned the immune system problem. We actually created a 10-week engagement that we run inside big companies. We found a way of hacking culture at scale in a big company, which is kind of holy grail of change management. We piloted it with Procter & Gamble. We've done it 60 times with Black & Decker, HP, Visa, et cetera, et cetera. Can I go off the record here? Do we know if this is going to get broadcast? I'll be careful.
Maybe you can edit this part
One of the
out.
top 3 accounting firms in the world has just asked us to use this methodology to transform the whole company, 400,000 people. So we're like, okay, where do we start? So that's one thing. We have a nonprofit that does the same transformation in public sector. Because in public sector, the existing policy is the immune system, right? We have bankers fighting Bitcoin, we have taxis fighting Uber. We're not progressing society along. And so we adapted the process in this nonprofit. It takes 16 weeks, but it works, and we've done it a bunch of times. Most notably a few years ago with the mayor of Miami. So a lot of the buzz that you hear about Miami as a city over the last few years is because we were able to get public sector to view disruptive technologies as an opportunity, not a threat, right? And now the mayor wants to be paid in Bitcoin, et cetera, et cetera. I think for a family office, I think about 3 things. 1, be aware and educate yourselves on the exponential technologies because it'll inform your investment thesis in a very powerful way that is absolutely necessary and mandatory for what's coming. Second, we have a free survey where you can actually take any of your investments and score them on this model. And so you can just take the survey and run any portfolio companies or potential investments into how scalable is that in particular investment. And the third thing I would do is take a few of your family office investment officers or folks and train them in this model. Now, again, we offer a lot of this for free just because it's turning out to be the most powerful metric for how we think about the future. Can I throw out a data point here?
Please.
So when we wrote the original book 10 years ago, in early 2015, we scored the Fortune 100 against this model. Right? So we went through the Fortune 100 and all the characteristics of the model with about 100 of my community members. We created an index of the Fortune 100 ranked by how do they have an MTP, are they purpose-driven, do they leverage community, do they use OKRs, do they deliver autonomy, et cetera, et cetera. And we went through all of them, GE, Goldman Sachs, et cetera. I did a segment on CNBC Squawk Box talking about this index. One of my community members who works for UBS tracked for 7 years which of these Fortune 100 used this model the most over a 7-year period, and the 10 companies that used them the least. So really we're measuring the most agile and flexible of the Fortune 100 versus the least agile and least flexible over that 7-year period. At the end of the 7 years, he did a kind of a back testing and where are they now, and found that the top 10 most flexible and agile according to our index delivered 40 times more shareholder returns than the bottom 10. Not percent, times, right? Like the data is so insane, we had to triple check the numbers.
Weren't you going to create an index that people could invest in?
We totally screwed up on this. We should have created an index fund. It would have been the most successful fund in the history of management. Why? Because as the external world becomes more volatile, your ability to adapt will drive market value, and we have the ability to pick out the most adaptable organizations, right? And so we're now going through the process of doing that. I was so focused on building the community that I left the important part behind.
Well, there happens to be an investment community here.
Well, there we can certainly
we
look
might be
at
interested.
that. Yeah. So I have 40,000 folks trained in this model that can help family offices act as coaches, et cetera, but the tools are also available for free.
Yeah, and speaking again to family office culture, I had the opportunity to bring Salim in to work with a family that I was CIO for a time. And the family has a very successful business. It was a cash cow, but you could see that it was a model that wasn't going to survive the test of time. And despite the many transformative ideas that Salim and his team brought to the table, the family was just too afraid to make the changes. And so I just want to put that out there, that it's actually really up to the principals of a family to really face that fear with courage, because change is really truly inevitable, and the more we can embrace this, the better it is for the generations that are ahead. So speaking of the future, what is the future of investing in Web3 and Bitcoin?
Future of investing in Web3 and Bitcoin? Buy Bitcoin, that's an easy one. How many of you are Bitcoin investors? Okay, the rest of you do the research. Michael Saylor, who's the CEO of MicroStrategies, talks about this in the following way. Do 100 hours of research on Bitcoin, and then I dare you to not be excited by it. Okay, and the reason is very simple. Some of you may know the name Jeff Booth, who ran YPO Vancouver for a while. Jeff wrote a book called The Price of Tomorrow, which I urge you to go read. It's not a big book, a summary of some of what I've said today. He made a very startling observation after going and talking to Larry Fink and Ray Dalio and talking to all the economists, which is that over the last 50 years, every dollar increase in global GDP has come with a $4 increase in global debt. Okay? That is ridiculous. So we're growing the global economy by borrowing from the future. Obviously not sustainable. Go to a bank and say, please lend me $10 million and I'll return you 2.5 and see how quickly you get shown the door. So we're essentially taxing the future and growing the global economy that way. And during the pandemic, we printed 40% of all the US dollars in existence, and then we wonder why we have inflation. Of course you're gonna have inflation if you've printed 40% more of the money supply. And the problem literally comes down to Moore's law. In the 1970s, early 70s, when they floated off the gold standard and Nixon moved the dollar off the gold standard, they didn't realize that technology was deflationary. Moore's law had not taken hold. It was not in public consciousness yet. So if I borrow $10 million to build a TV factory, and a year later those TVs can only be sold for half the price, I can't ever pay that money back. And so a deflationary technology environment does not work with a credit-based system where you grow the economy with debt. It means you can't ever pay the money back. That's why the debt is growing globally. Okay? So Bitcoin is a hedge against that problem. Now you ask Jeff, and I've asked him, okay, when will it all implode? And he's like, which snowflake is going to cause the avalanche? You know the avalanche is coming. You can do the math on it. So therefore, you have two options. Do not be in cash, which many of you are not. Be in assets or in the stock market. And the reason that those are at record high prices is not because of underlying performance or underlying value. It's just that the dollar and fiat currencies are dropping in value radically. So that's what's actually going on. So check it out, do research, have a listen to it, read Jeff's book. For me, Bitcoin is the only, I've watched over the years different attempts at this. And let me just make a point about digital currencies. If you're launching a digital currency and reserve system, you want to hit 3 points on a triangle. You want decentralization, security, and scalability for a digital currency. When Bitcoin first came out, it hit decentralization and security for the first time ever, and people got very excited about it. But it wasn't scalable. So a lot of the altcoins, Ethereum, and Cardano, and Solana, all tried to solve for the scalability problem. But in doing so, they usually compromised on decentralization or they compromised on security. Hence the FTX collapse, hence the collapse of Luna, et cetera. Over the last few years, the Bitcoin community has built what's called the Lightning Network, which makes Bitcoin scalable. And the smartest people I know now are putting all of their money into Bitcoin. Because as a hedge to the existing system, which if you have a thesis that may have a problem, this is a great hedge against it. Then people complain about the energy usage of it, okay? It turns out more and more of it, all the fractional increase in Bitcoin mining is all done using renewables today. And over time will just become increasingly renewable, so there's not much energy cost, it's all marginal energy, okay? If there's a hydroelectric plant in the north of Quebec where you can't get the energy down to a population quickly enough, you put a Bitcoin mine next to it and then you harvest the Bitcoin there. Or put an AI data center next to that. And so there's some really powerful things happening around this. Happy to talk about more later, but we don't need to get it more.
I'm sure you're going to get a lot of questions
over
cocktails.
I'm what would be called a Bitcoin maximalist. So grab me over some drinks, or later tonight, and we'll talk about more about it.
I feel like this last question is obvious. You can answer it quickly, and I might take some from the audience, but why do governments call you to the rescue?
Why do governments call me to the rescue?
I mean, it seems obvious now.
I'm not sure they call me to rescue. They call me to figure out what the hell's going on, and I give them some sense of it. As we move to this new world and move to a decentralized, demonetized, democratized world of technology, how do you enable that? And we have a huge challenge with democracy, with entrepreneurship in many, many countries, okay? I live in the US because in Canada, trying to be an entrepreneur is a really hard challenge. Right? I got somewhat blacklisted by the VC community here because a few years ago I was trying to raise money and they wanted to see 5-year P&L statements and financials, and they wouldn't invest unless I was profitable. And finally I got angry at a VC conference and I said, do you know there's a V in the name? You're supposed to venture the capital, at which point I wasn't going to get capital anymore. So I went to Silicon Valley and built a company, sold it to Google, et cetera, et cetera. So and this is true for most of the world. In most of the world, if you build a business and you fail, you're a failure. Right? And Silicon Valley is unique that if we build a business and it fails, we call it experience. And the best framing I have for this is when a child sits down to play the piano for the first time ever, they're terrible at it. And we don't say, don't ever play again, you're clearly terrible at this. We say, keep practicing till you get it right. And yet when people build businesses, we say, you're clearly terrible at building business, don't ever do it again. And it takes, if you talk to anybody, it takes several times at the piñata to figure out how to build a business. The first time that you get the cap table wrong, second time there's the wrong go-to-market strategy, third time some pandemic wipes you out, whatever. It takes a few times to get it right. And so the culture of innovating is deeply important to anywhere. And I think that's what we're seeing with the democratization that gets me really excited. So for example, there's a car that's been developed, an electric car called the Vega, okay? It's 900 horsepower, it's the third fastest car in the world. Looks a bit like a Lamborghini. This has been engineered and designed and built on the island of Sri Lanka, that hotbed of automotive engineering, right? So I'm going to suggest to you, if you can build the third fastest car in the world with no investors, no ecosystem, no experience, and no education, you can pretty much do anything anywhere. And I used the Vitalik example earlier. And so we're going to see an explosion of disruptive innovation coming from everywhere, and the opportunity for family offices is to find that disruption and back it, especially the ones that are really trying to do good things and change the world in a constructive, positive way.
Yeah, I mean, I love family office investing because family offices are the ones that can take the longest duration risk.
Hugely important.
Huge duration risk. So we have time for a couple of questions from the audience.
I covered a few different areas there. Yes, ma'am.
I heard your comment about venture in Canada, lacks venture in Canada.
Yeah.
What do you think Canada is good at?
So I think Canada is incredibly good at diversity, and that's one of the most important metrics of success is having different inputs and listening to people and having different cultures, gender, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's number one. I think there's an incredibly important role that Canada should be playing, which is that you should be testing out new ideas and new social structures because we can. For example, universal basic income. Right? How many of you are familiar with UBI? So Andrew Yang campaigned on this in the presidential election a few years ago. The idea is to give people a basic amount of income, and then you can dismantle a lot of government programs, okay? And the idea is to give people enough money to survive but not be happy, because then you have a thriving economy, et cetera. We've seen 14 major experiments around this. It's been profoundly successful when it's done fully and properly. Okay. One of the most successful cases was here in Canada, in Manitoba, where they gave a UBI to people. And it was so successful that after a few years, the government said, wait a minute, we're not even needed, and they canceled the program, which is terrible. Now, we're going to get to that just because the current structures won't work. But the problem of going from a social taxation, job, union, employment construct to that is such a big leap. We have no confidence in public sector in getting us there. So family offices could do something interesting and pilot some of these ideas and test them out, because I'm sure that's where we're going to go. My point is that I think Canada has the opportunity, not just the opportunity, I think the obligation, because of the relative safety of the country. You're also not, I mean, I live in the US, but Mike, if you've seen Lord of the Rings, I'm like Gollum with the Precious with my Canadian passport. I'm gonna hold on to that thing, because the US is totally imploding in all sorts of ways as far as we can see. So it's one of the most important countries in the world. I wish it would live up to that. And I think testing new social structures and constructs here, like UBI, would be an incredibly powerful, important thing. And have Canada be a beacon for the future. I'll give you one other idea for Canada, which came to me from John Beck, who's the CEO of Aecon, with a construction company. And he built the airport in Quito in Ecuador, and he did it without any corruption. And so everybody's like, how the hell did you build an airport in a third world country? Because the minute you get the contract, the mayor's brother comes along and says, you really want to use my construction company for this. And he did something incredibly clever. He went to the Prime Minister's office here, and he went to the President's office in Ecuador and said, I want you to say that you're overseeing this project. And then when people came for handouts, he'd say, if you can get clearance from my government and your government that you're an authorized vendor, then we'll work with you. And of course, that was too much of a hassle, so they just gave up. And he built the entire airport without that. And I was building on this with another idea. Canada should be an anti-corruption service for infrastructure projects, tax each project for a % or two, and provide oversight and leverage the brand. That's what I would do if I was Canada.
One more question?
There's a question back there. Yes, sir.
Melody also was saying earlier on stage that it's potentially a great era for small caps in the next little bit. I'm curious what you think of that.
Absolutely 100% agree. Big companies cannot innovate because of that immune system problem, and they can't take risk. Right? So the only structure we've seen is where you spin off these ventures on the edge. Larry Page came to me at Google a few years ago and said, hey, your unit at Yahoo is really successful. Should I do that at Google? And my response was, no, you'll have this immune system problem. Keep it stealth, point it into adjacent areas. And you see the result is Google X, where they have Google Car, Google contact lenses, et cetera, spinning off into adjacent market spaces. The master of this technique, in my opinion, is Apple. And yes, they have a great design capability and a great technology supply chain. I argue that Apple's core innovation is actually organizational, because they will form a small team that's very disruptive, put the team at the edge of the company, keep them secret and stealth, and say to them, go disrupt another industry. Whether it's watches or payments or retail, there's no limit to their market cap. They just go into different industries and iterate very well with their design thinking capability. I think that becomes the MO for most big companies. The 20th century mindset was integrate and become larger. The 21st century mindset is decentralized and become an ecosystem. So you see Google breaking up into Alphabet. Facebook is leaving Instagram and WhatsApp on the edges as much as possible. Uber is trying to turn into an ecosystem, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the challenge with a big company, very hard to take on any disruptive innovation. Hence, Microsoft goes and invests in OpenAI, because they can't do it themselves. Google, that invented OpenAI, or invented large language models, didn't do it inside Google, right? And actually was here in Toronto having a conversation with Geoffrey Hinton back in 2017, and I asked him, what's the next step in AI? And he said, we need a new breakthrough because deep learning has reached its limitations. We don't know what that is. And 3 months later, the Transformer paper was published. And Google created this, but they were too scared to launch it until OpenAI came along and said, the hell with it. By the way, I've not found a single mechanism of any kind that we will be able to regulate AI. Like zero. You'd have to regulate every line of code, and I just don't see how we're going to be able to do that. So AI, the horse has left the barn, like way left the barn.
Thank you.